Thank you so much for speaking to NDTV. Vladimir Putin is in Delhi right now amid the Ukraine war, Western sanctions, and renewed geopolitical churn. What does the timing of this visit signal about the current state of India Russia relations?
I think it's a visit that's meant to reassert the continued strength of the India-Russia partnership. I mean, this is Putin's first visit to India in 4 years, and more importantly, it's his first visit since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so, this is a war that India has always opposed. It's made things difficult for India for a number of reasons. One being that Russia has gotten closer to China because of the war. And of course, most recently, we have seen, following pressure from the US to stop importing Russian oil, that India has indeed reduced some of its imports of Russian oil, which is something that does not benefit the India-Russia energy partnership, which is a big part of the relationship. So I think the bottom line is that this visit is meant to signify that despite some of the recent developments in the relationship, this is still a very important relationship, and I suspect that the two men will try to chart a new path and perhaps focus more on the defense side, as well as trade more broadly, really just to signify, with a U.S. audience in mind in particular, that India is not going to cave to pressure from the U.S. to back away from Russia in a big way.
You say this visit could be more about optics and symbolism, or would you say it does point to a deeper strategic recalibration between Delhi and Moscow?
Well, I mean, certainly it's symbolic. It's going to be about optics in the sense that it is important, I think, for both leaders to be seen together, to show a Western audience that Western pressure is not going to drive these two men apart. So there is a very strong optic there, much like we saw when Prime Minister Modi was in China this past summer, and he met with President Xi and President Putin, the three of them together. That really sent a very strong message to the West as well, and particularly President Trump. But I think in this case, it's all about sending a similar signal. I do think that there is something more than this visit is not just about optics and symbolism. I do think that it's meant to signal a new phase in their relationship. I think that the two leaders are going to try to focus on some newer issues, or not newer issues, but issues that might not have gotten as much focus as they had before, and that entails trade beyond energy. I think that we're going to see efforts on the part of India to figure out ways to expand or increase its exports to Russia to balance the trade relationship more in India's favor. And I think there's also going to be some discussion around new arms deals. That's always a big part of the relationship. But there will be more of the same, and there will be some
Right.
awkward moments. I suspect that Modi will gently tell Putin that this is not a war that should be fought. That's of course been his consistent position.
How closely would the Donald Trump White House be tracking this visit, Michael? And what do you believe would be the main concern that Trump would have when he sees the visuals from this evening, from Friday, of Modi and Putin together, and with Putin being in Delhi at this moment?
I mean, it's a very important moment in the war from a U.S. perspective because there's a peace process that Trump has sought to author that's really it's been picking up pace in the sense that the President Trump really wants to see some progress. And so, in that sense, for Putin to come to India now should not necessarily be seen as a bad thing from Washington's perspective, in that hopefully the White House knows that Modi and his government oppose the war, and they feel similarly to the Trump administration. They want it to end. But since it's a delicate moment, I think that for the White House, there might be some concern that instead of Modi focusing this visit on trying to push Putin to agree to a peace process, that instead he's going to focus on strengthening partnership and looking for additional ways to do business together, which is not what President Trump would want to see at this point.
Right. And would you say that this visit would, in a way, weaken the West's way of looking at things in terms of Putin being isolated? Would this visit to India weaken that perception that has been created at this point by the West?
Well, I mean, if that perception was accurate, which it is not, then I think that yes, I mean, this would undercut that perception. But I'd like to hope that the West recognizes that Russia is not at all isolated. I mean, you could look at the BRICS summit several years ago that was convened by Russia, and you had dozens of countries that were there, which I think was a reflection of growing unhappiness among the global South and a number of countries outside the West that are not happy with the world order and the Western role in it. And then more recently, you have Modi and Xi and Putin meeting in China. So, I'd like to hope that the West does not think that that is actually the case. It's true that this is what the West wants to do. It wants to isolate him. But it's clear that clearly has not been successful. Though we are seeing some of these sanctions threats paying off, in that India is now starting to reduce a bit its oil imports from Russia. But bottom line is that Russia is not isolated, and hopefully the West recognizes that, or at least acknowledges it.
About oil, let's just elaborate on that. India's Russian oil imports have fallen after the Trump administration imposed tough new sanctions on key Kremlin linked exporters. Now, with Putin in Delhi right now, Michael, how does this slump reshape the energy equation, if it does, between the two countries? And what would you say is Washington, D.C.'s reading on this?
Well, I mean, clearly, the Trump administration is pleased to see that India has cut back. We've had seen some pretty notable cutbacks in Russian oil imports coming to India since the new U.S. sanctions on the on several key Russian energy giants went into effect. I think on November 21st. The fact that Reliance has essentially reduced significantly its imports of Russian oil, that's also I think a big deal from Washington's perspective. Um, but it's a complicated energy relationship. It was only after the war began in Ukraine that India began expanding in a big way its imports of Russian oil. It was actually importing a lot of American oil before that. And 2021, the year before the war, India was actually the top destination for American oil exports. So that suggests that
Mhm.
there could be a way to bring things back. But clearly the U.S. wants India to do more, and I think that as negotiations between the U.S. and India continue on a trade deal, I suspect that Indian negotiators will hear more on that front from the U.S. But again, I mean, we've seen significant changes from India in terms of its willingness to cut back, at least for now, on some of these imports.
Marco remains a spine, if I may say so, of the India Russia ties, as fresh defense conversations talks are going to unfold while Putin is in India. Is Russia still India's most critical military partner, or is that era clearly evolving?
I think in terms of strict numbers, Russia continues to be the top supplier of arms to India, but we've seen in recent years that India has taken on a policy of diversification where it's trying to increase its share of arms from other countries, and some of its most, not surprisingly, some of its most important other partners, the U.S., France, and Israel, have started to contribute more arms, and the share of arms coming from those countries has increased significantly, which suggests that over the long term, the trajectory of India-Russia defense cooperation might not be so favorable. If we could assume that the U.S.-India relationship will bounce back, which I imagine it will, we'll see arms sales continue there. Just recently, the U.S. and India
Mm.
signed a new defense framework agreement, which suggests that more to come in terms of arms sales. I think that Russia's war and the war in Ukraine, I think it makes it a bit more difficult, perhaps, to be comfortable that Russia will be able to continue to supply India with large platforms in a timely fashion, just because it's fighting its war in Ukraine. So, I think that the longer term prognosis for India-Russia energy, pardon me, defense cooperation is a bit fuzzy, is a bit unclear. But for now, in the immediate term, Russia continues to be that player, that key player, and so much of India's defense industry and defense technologies
Yes.
continue to be drawing on Russian material.
So let's talk about the S-400 also for a moment. We're talking about defense, we've spoken about oil. How does the Trump led Washington view India continuing to induct and operate Russian systems like the S-400 amid sanctions on Moscow?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing an administration in Washington that is taking what for many is a surprisingly hard line on
Hmm.
India's business with Russia. I mean, President Trump has always taken a more moderate view of Russia compared to the Biden administration. He's signaled his admiration for Putin in the past. Um, but what Trump is concerned about is getting a peace deal in Ukraine. And so I think that if that were to happen, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But if the war were to end in Ukraine, I don't think India would face nearly as much pressure from the U.S. as it is now for its doing business with Russia. Clearly, Trump wants to pressure Russia into buying into the peace process by trying to wean Russia's top trade partners away from Russia, and this is how India has come into the crosshairs. So for now, absolutely, and so long as efforts continue to try to get a peace deal, I think that India will take a lot of heat from the Trump administration when it comes to its energy imports, but also potential new arms imports from Russia.
Morning, I was speaking to an NDTV correspondent based in Moscow, and she was saying that when it comes to the Kremlin, they believe in their tie with China being absolutely separate from their ties with India. So let's move to China now. How central is the China factor to Putin's engagement with India this time?
Well, I mean, as I think I said earlier, one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine is that Russia has moved closer to China, perhaps closer than China is comfortable with. But this is clearly very concerning for India, given
Mm,
its longstanding rivalry with Beijing. I think that Putin wants to balance Russia's relations with both China and India. But let's be very clear. I mean, not to state the obvious, but Russia's relationship with India is much deeper and safer than its relationship with China, which is something that has been accompanied by a lot of rhetoric, no limits relationship, all that, but it's relatively new. And I'm not sure, as I said, that China is really comfortable with Russia getting as close to it as it is. So I don't think necessarily that the China factor will loom that large at this summit. Though I will say that if you look at how India has sought to use some of Russia's weapons, including the S-400 platform. There's reason to believe that India wants to use some of these weapons to counter China, which I think
yes.
raises an interesting question from a Russian perspective.
Right. And from India's perspective, does continued engagement with Russia still serve perhaps as a hedge against an assertive China?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's so many reasons why India needs to continue to have a strong partnership with Russia. I mean, one thing is that India likes to emphasize that it does not turn on its closest friends, and Russia, of course, for several decades, going back to the Soviet Union during the latter decades of the Cold War, has arguably been India's closest, most dependable friend. So there's that, and the arms supplies that continue to come in now are important, particularly in light of India's recent conflict with Pakistan, which was, of course, the most serious conflict we've seen between those two countries since the '71 war. So that equipment, that weaponry from Russia will continue to be important, and in the energy too. I mean, even if India is cutting back, I mean, it continues to say that it's trying to find the cheapest possible deal to address energy security for its massive population. So, in that sense, it's not just going to want to shrug off Russia, given what that could mean for India's energy security. So, I think that there's a number of reasons why India thinks that this relationship will continue to be essential. That's obviously going to be a main message from the summit. But
Right.
China is only part of this story.
And my last question, Michael, before I let you go, does this visit underscore India's version of multi alignment in a polarized world? It's a word often used by the Indian government, by the Modi government, multi alignment. What would you say on that?
I mean, to me, multi-alignment is the new strategic autonomy. It's essentially the same thing, but I think it's about adjusting to what has become a significant amount of geopolitical churn. And I think it entails India doing what it has to do to continue balancing ties with all of its friends. Many of these friends are rivals with each other, like the US and Russia. And it might mean making some adjustments in some of these relationships. I do think that India might need to rethink the emphases and the anchors of its relationship with Russia, particularly as the energy partnership becomes a bit shaky. So that's all part of multi-alignment. And I think that multi-alignment needs to emphasize adaptability, right? It needs to respond to major changes in the world order, which we've seen in great part because of the Trump effect, but other factors as well, including the war in Ukraine. So yes, I think that by having Putin in India for the first time in 4 years, I think it signals that even as India continues to bolster its partnerships with its friends in the West, it is going to continue to double down on its very special relationship with Russia.
Michael Kugelman, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for adding perspective to Putin's visit to India, and thank you for speaking with NDTV.
Thanks for having me.